Next week, the whole world is going to descend both virtually and IRL onto Glasgow for the COP26 Climate Summit, which is seen as the most significant global climate event since the 2015 Paris Agreement. There's a lot of hype in the region and in the world around it at the moment. Some leaders and some countries are pledging big. There's big commitments for 2030 and 2050. And other countries are pledging targets that arguably lack ambition and modelling. With the youth of today being the last generation that can end the climate crisis, we're here really to talk about what to look out for as we watch the news and analysis is just going to be coming through in the coming weeks. Today, it's going to be a really holistic discussion. I really want you to start thinking about what to look out for, what elements of policies that are pledged to kind of consider. And really, we want to take a pulse of climate action in the region and profile the expertise of some truly wonderful up-and-coming climate active experts from Australia, Indonesia, and Korea. And we have some expertise on the Pacific as well. So very sort of multidisciplinary panel today. And those panelists are, and you'll hear from them in a little while, Clayton, Research Officer at Trobe Asia, Doni Marmer, Research Fellow at the Resilience Development Institute, Mia Dunphy, PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne and co-director of Climates, and Eunji Park, Project Associate at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and she is joining us from Vienna. So it's London, but she lives in Vienna, sorry. So a very international panel. Now, to get us into the zone, I'd really like to poll. It's something we do all the time at Gen A, and I'd really like to get a sense of your sentiments towards the climate crisis at the moment. So my colleague Lena is going to show a poll. Lena, if you wouldn't mind sharing that first one. Okay, so question 1, what do you think is the greatest stumbling block to climate action? Is it government action? Is it technology? Is it public support? Or business action? And I'll just give you a few seconds to submit your answers. Christos says, can we have a tick box for all of the above? I wish we could. You've got to choose one. Okay, awesome. All right. Thank you. And then we'll just show those results here. Government action, 67%. Whew, that's a big one. And I think we'll be getting into that a little bit later as well. The next is business action, which is really interesting. And we will be having an Asia Society event all about the business of climate change. So really fascinating. Okay, thank you. Now we're warmed up a bit. I've got one more question for you. So we'll just show that poll. Okay, so this is really thinking about, we've got a panel of young experts. Obviously, this demographic that we have here, we are not the youngest generation, but we are the young generation that I personally think can have the most action and effect on the climate crisis at the moment. So, in your opinion, how important is the role of youth in climate action? Absolutely essential, it's important but limited, makes little difference, or we are of no importance at all. So feel free to answer with your heart and your feeling. Okay. Oh, wow. So we're split. So that is very heartening to see that people think we are absolutely essential, but then almost half of us think, yes, our role is important, but we are limited. And I think today what I want to get out of it is just what power we can have in terms of tackling the climate crisis. So in fact, and thank you all so much for your answers. On that note, we have a special message from Asia Society Global CEO and President, former PM of Australia, Kevin Rudd. He joined us a little bit earlier today to kind of just start off this conversation a little bit more and really highlight from that kind of leader's perspective a few things that I think you should be looking out for coming up to COP26 next week. So we'll play that now.
Well, greetings. My name is Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asia Society globally, normally based in New York, but now in Brisbane, capital of the world. Well, not really. Greetings to all of you across Australia, across the Republic of Korea, and across the Swiss Confederation. It's great to be with you to talk about the challenge of our time, climate change. A decade or so ago, I got into all sorts of trouble in Australian politics when then as Prime Minister I described climate change as the greatest economic, environmental and moral challenge of our generation. But guess what? A decade later, I haven't changed my views one bit. It's a serious economic challenge because if we proceed to burn the planet, the consequences in terms of growth, of living standards, and of employment will be huge and dramatic for both developed and developing countries. Environmentally, of course, it is a parallel disaster, because if we don't keep temperature increases this century within 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, then the impact in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of drought, in terms of flood, in terms of agriculture, will also be beyond our current imaginings. And that's essentially the conclusion of the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists as well. I also said it was a great moral challenge of our generation. And the reason I said that is because at its essence, this is a question of intergenerational justice. That is, what climate and what environment does my generation leave you, the young people of the world? And that is essentially a moral question. It's an ethical question. It's a question of intergenerational justice. And I make no apology whatsoever for using that language a decade ago, even though many were offended by it or claimed to be alienated by it. I couldn't care less. I'm not in the business of making people feel good. I'm interested in the business of how do we make a material change to the current trajectory of climate change and therefore preserve the planet for the next generation of young people around the world. So where are we up to right now? As you know, COP26 is about to be convened in Glasgow. I'm a veteran of the Bali COP of 2007. In fact, it was the first conference of the parties I attended, and it was held in Bali in Indonesia. And I was then proud to represent Australia, having just ratified the Kyoto Protocol and indicated that Australia then wanted to be a full participant in international collaboration in bringing global greenhouse gas emissions down. Then I represented Australia with a large delegation at the Conference of the Parties called COP16 at Copenhagen, where we negotiated successfully the Copenhagen Accord. For the first time, we got agreement among a core group of 20 countries, that is effectively the G20 countries, on the need to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade, for this to be achieved by actions by both developed and developing countries, because up until that point, it had been purely a developed country responsibility. Thirdly, for this to be done through a global system of measurement, reporting and verification. And finally, that we had a global climate fund building to $100 billion a year by 2020 to assist with the mitigation and adaptation effects for the poorest and most climate exposed countries in the world. That formed the foundation stone for what then was agreed to in Paris in 2015, which set up a framework which replaced the Kyoto Protocol framework, which enabled every country participating in the COP process, all 192 of them, bring forward their own nationally determined commitments, or NDCs, a term you'll hear a lot about in the lead up to COP26, when countries have to determine what they will do for the 5-year period ahead to bring their global greenhouse gas emissions down, and down to the extent necessary that when you put all those NDCs together, from the biggest economies to the smallest across the world, that they add up to the level of reductions necessary to keep temperature increases in that 1.5 to 2 degree range. So that's where we got to with the Paris Agreement in 2015. This Conference of the Parties at Glasgow is the 5-yearly update. In fact, it's become 6 because of COVID from the Paris Treaty. And that was designed to enable the international community to come together at summit level every 5 years to renew, update, and improve their greenhouse gas reduction targets delivered through their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions for the previous 5 years. And so all countries of the world, including Australia, the Republic of Korea, Switzerland, and others, are now due to deliver their NDC updates. And that's why this one is so important. It's doubly important because the NDCs produced at Paris in the 12 months after Paris, if you put them all together, and if they're all fully implemented for all the countries in the world, it would have added up to still only 1/3 the amount of greenhouse gas reductions that was necessary globally in order to keep those temperature increases between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. So there's a task at hand, which is what do we do additionally in order to close that 2/3 gap? And it's a very big gap indeed. It's good to see the United States back in the game. President Biden's committed the United States to reducing American greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030 when measured against 2005 benchmarks. The European Union has adopted an even more ambitious target than that. The government of Japan has adopted the same, and the Republic of Korea has adopted the same. Of course, unfortunately, our country, the Commonwealth of Australia, has not. And Prime Minister Morrison has indicated that he won't be adopting a more ambitious 2030 target. Finally, the reason why this is so important, that is 2030 targets, is that unless we have greater ambition for greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, the transition from 2030 to 2050 carbon neutrality is just too steep, so steep that it could never be realised. In fact, I'm somewhat sceptical when politicians talk about carbon neutrality for 2050, where they're just saying, thank you, that's for the future. I'm not going to be in office by then. I don't care. That's for someone else to sort out. Whereas, frankly, you cannot sort it out in the future unless you've got to a better position of carbon reduction, greenhouse gases reduction by 2030, in order to make the adjustment curve much more doable in practice. So when you hear a lot about nationally determined commitments, you hear a lot about carbon neutrality by 2050, and when you hear a lot about what needs to be done in order to increase greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2030, and the means by which you get there through legislated mechanisms, that's where all these individual elements fit into the wider picture of climate change action. I'd encourage each of you as young people to be engaged with the debate as it unfolds in Glasgow. I'd encourage each of you to be engaged in the debates with your own national governments, whether it's in Australia, the ROK, or Switzerland, or elsewhere in the world, because this is a moral challenge for all of us. This is an environmental challenge for all of us. And it is an economic challenge for all of us. But most importantly, and this is where the Asian Society fits in as well, it's also about us as countries working together for a common good, a global good, which benefits all humankind. Go well.
I hope that you got the message there, which really was engage with the debate, which is really what we are doing today, and go well indeed. So let's get right into it. Eunji, I want to take a pulse check. I'd like you to start us off as a young climate active change maker who is making a career in this space. How do you feel about climate change in the region personally? And how important will the outcomes of COP26 be for the world?
Well, thank you, Eloise, and it's such a pleasure to open this discussion with this question. Well, first, I find that 2021 is a really critical year to touch upon all these topics addressing energy access, economic recovery from COVID, and climate change. And in line to your first question, I think that climate change is dire because it really disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, particularly like coastal communities and small island developing states, which are like placed in the forefront as they're experiencing like the rise of sea levels, and this ultimately destroys their infrastructure, crops, residential areas, and really fragment their livelihood options. So in line with all this, I think COP26 is really important in providing the ground to discuss the 2030 emissions reduction targets of countries, and also see how this will align to reaching net zero in 2050. Well, like the poll was very interesting to see how government will be the biggest like the biggest challenge in terms of addressing the climate goals. But I still think they have the key role in seizing the opportunity to direct the economies and energy systems away from fossil fuels. I think that's the really big role of that, and also to build back better, and that we can also achieve this resilient, sustainable future. Delivering the outcomes of this in COP26 will be important because we would have to address these national commitments and climate plans, but this will be pushed ultimately from engaging the private sector, civil societies and individuals, particularly us youth. And I think we will mainly play the role in overseeing and providing the voice and shaping the climate agenda within our respective communities. So yeah.
Wonderful. What a great way to start this discussion. We actually absolutely are the voice and the people who will have to carry out a lot of what is promised in Glasgow next week. So Kate, I want to bring you in now, and I want to talk about a little bit more broadly. Let's put a little bit of an IR lens in terms of thinking about what's so important about next week in line with security. So how has climate change changed traditional thinking on security issues? And how should it play a role in the formation of national security policy?
Yeah, all right. Thanks so much, Eloise and everyone. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the other speakers tonight. So being in security studies, I tend to look at the world from an incredibly pessimistic view. It's kind of what's going to kill us, which is quite depressing, I think. But I think those are the problems that young people face in terms of how do we manage things like our mental health and this ongoing existential threat. And at the base of it, that's what security is on a really basic level. It's do you have good mental health? Do you have a food over your head, a roof over your head, food security? All of these things are security on a really basic level. But when we're looking at how states negotiate climate security, they're looking at their interests. So for Australia, for example, it would be economic security. Do we have economic security? Can our economy kind of continue to traject in this way with our coal and our iron ore and those sorts of things? So Australia's national security focus is very kind of focused on the top. Do they have the economic ability to maintain their current security? Whereas climate change really doesn't kind of affect the top in that way. It affects everyone on a really basic level. And that's what's kind of being challenged. And I think that's why it's so hard for climate change to be solved by the international community, because we're used to be solved issues that are state issues where states are the threats. So climate change completely challenges our conception of what's a threat, in that it's not the state, it's this complete thing that doesn't adhere to sovereignty, it doesn't adhere to territorial boundaries. And that's why states, I think, have struggled for decades to do anything about it, because it's challenging their kind of really basic levels of what security and what statehood is. Climate change doesn't stop at a border in any meaningful way. And I think as young people, we see Australia investing billions in submarines, but that's a completely different future to the one we think of. We don't think of submarines, climate change is inevitable, but a conflict with China isn't. So we're kind of looking at where your national security and which groups are the national security groups trying to actually secure. Are they securing the government, or are they securing the people? And I think a national security that's reimagined to secure the people, whether that's in Australia, whether that's our neighbours in the Pacific, is kind of reorientating the target of the policy, and that climate change and security is about the people and not the states.
What a great overview. Thank you so much, Kate. I actually just wanted to follow up on that very sneaky comment you made about spending billions on defence. You recently had a tweet go viral, or at least viral in my opinion. And everybody, if you're not following Kate Clayton on Twitter, you absolutely should. So I just wanted to pinpoint that a little bit more. Your tweet was on defence spending towards a new AUKUS security deal. What do you think is a consequence of spending more money on sort of defence than it is on climate change, especially for young people?
I think it's just looking at a government that doesn't represent our future and isn't trying to secure our future, but it's in fact securing their future. And I think when we're looking at things like AUKUS and governments in general, is that the Australian government itself is actually quite disconnected. For what I'm hearing in defence circles is that the Australian government, it's a political body. We vote them in, it's a political party, whereas the Defence Department, the Australian Defence Forces actually want to do things about climate change. And when I talk to them compared to other groups in the government, they're kind of the most forward thinking when it comes to climate change. So they're kind of like ready to go. We see the Defence Forces in bushfires, whether that's in Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, the US, and it's just kind of this domestic political focus on economic security that's kind of impeding any kind of concepts of security and climate change.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I think we'll get into that later when we talk about thinking about the solutions that will come out of it and the policies that come out of COP26 next week. I want to take a pulse check now about what's happening in the region. And I'll bring in Doni now, who is based in Melbourne, but originally from Indonesia. A simple one for you, not too big. How is climate change affecting the everyday lives of vulnerable communities in Indonesia? And a follow-up question to that will be, how is the Indonesian government responding to some of those challenges?
For sure. Thank you for the opportunity always, and also the questions. Maybe I would like firstly to shift the paradigm of us as a developing countries and more vulnerable. Yes, we are, but everyone living on Earth are actually vulnerable towards the impact of climate change. And we need to think about that when we think about the future. Now, talking about Indonesia, as kind of like someone working in disaster, we know that Indonesia is the supermarket of disasters. We have everything, you name it. I mean, it's not a common competitive term, but I think we experience a lot of things. And 80% of Indonesians live in the coastal area. So sea level rise is one of the alarming issues that we may experience in the near future. I'm sure some of you heard that Jakarta will sink very, very soon, and we try to rebuild the new capital city and stuff like that. I think that will be our usual song that we will hear for the next decade. So in terms of the intensity, one of the things that often overlooked, Indonesia also holds an important role in climate change mitigation conversation, where we actually have one of the biggest green area, like forests, tropical forests, rainforests, but also one of the biggest mangrove forest area coverage. And that could be one of the biggest solutions that we need to talk about, but also impacted by the increasing extreme weathers. Like when El Nino came, we always have massive forest fire. The worst one was in 2015, but the latest was in 2019. And that actually impacted our neighboring countries because of the haze, but also because of that, we produced a lot of CO2 as well, a lot of emissions. Other than that, there's a lot of issues on, because Indonesia is one of the biggest agricultural communities, so we rely a lot in our agriculture produce. We have a lot of failed crops because of the uncertainty of the weather, extended wet weather or extended dry weather, and a lot of dry land start to emerge, so arid areas start to expand pretty massively. And of course, flash floods, landslides. What else? Like I said, it's a supermarket, so you can't just choose like Woolies. What do you want today? We can just have it. But also aside from that, talking about the impact, I think people starting to have a conversation about resilience. So how to adapt to disasters, how to gain more confidence in responding to disasters and bounce back from it. But that's also the thing that is not discussed or implemented or put in the policy or the next recommendation in our NDCs and in our COP26 submission. So from still right now, we're still asking and begging from developed countries to invest more. But see what happened with Norway. We have a failed relationship with our Red Plus scheme. So I think I'm not sure what sort of things that we can demand other than that we are the one who impacted, need to take ownership and take action towards it together, actually.
Thank you so much for that overview, Doni. It's a sad supermarket analogy, but one that kind of paints a very real picture. But we might get onto some optimism later. I wanted to bring Mia in now. I know that you have expertise on Indonesia as well, Mia, but you do also do some work in the Pacific. So I just wondered if you could paint a picture for us on the Pacific, you know, and what's going on there. And arguably it's the most vulnerable kind of region of the world to the effects of climate change. Is there a unified approach to climate change in the Pacific? And what's the feeling there ahead of COP26?
Yeah, thanks so much. Great to see you all, even if it's online. Yeah, so when someone kind of talks or writes about climate change, I guess many people often think of the Pacific because it is a place where climate change is happening so blatantly. It's literally right in front of our eyes. We're seeing this, we're seeing pictures or hearing of sea level rises, increasing cyclone severity, flooding, erosion, kind of like the supermarket that Doni was talking about as well. And so all of these events are having an impact on the everyday life of younger and older people in the Pacific. And through some of my work that I did in Vanuatu and Fiji, I have witnessed and I've had discussions with communities about kind of changing weather or soils or floods and food, and kind of on a really day-to-day impact, I guess. The food and water which we all need to survive is becoming increasingly insecure with floods and droughts. And so the landscape is kind of changing, which is really impacting how people live and where they live. So we've seen kind of this migration that's happening, as well as how they kind of farm or what jobs that they can get, for example. But what I really wanted to stress, and what I think we need to to stress in these discussions, is that these marginalized communities are not passive victims within the climate crisis. There are so many organizations and communities that are actively working to build resilience and are adapting to the global and the local changes that are occurring. And so we need to ensure that their voices and these initiatives are heard and are listened to, as well as kind of supported through financial and capacity needs. I just wanted to kind of finish that question off by kind of talking about how every year I talk to people in the Pacific or in Indonesia and in Australia, and we all talk about these kind of like unprecedented events, right? Everyone's talking about the word unprecedented. I've never heard it so many times in my life the past couple of years, and it's way too much. It's freaking me out. And so I think we just need to ensure that we push our global leaders to commit to real action by listening to those most vulnerable to climate change. And so that's kind of what we're doing at the work with Climates, is we're supporting our partners in the Pacific. So for example, the Pacific Island Climate Action Network or the Vanuatu Climate Action Network to kind of go to COP through fundraising, for example, and to kind of hold these activities where they can have their voices heard on the kind of the global stage. Thank you, Eloise.
Oh, brilliant answer. Thank you so much. And I really encourage you to check out the work of Climates. And on that, listening to the most vulnerable, I know a lot of people on this call are kind of working with communities, with the community in Australia and also in the region. So if you're doing something amazing that you need help with, or you just need to spotlight, please feel free to share a link because there's a lot going on at the moment, and the more that we can look about it and learn about really the realities of what's happening in the region, the better, and at home too, of course. So let's move on now to some of those sort of big action items that are sort of happening around the world. And Eunji, I wanted to bring you back because I want to talk about South Korea, where you're originally from. So South Korea recently officially committed to reducing national carbon emissions by 40% of its 2018 levels by 2030, ahead of next week. That is a big deal. And it's a big deal because South Korea is one of the most fossil fuel reliant economies in the world. And it's actually very much like Australia, and a bit of a large debate that that is happening at the moment where I am. So can you tell us a little bit about how Korea plans to really navigate that massive shift towards clean energy, and how can other countries learn from its example?
Thank you for this question. And I really agree that this is a huge deal that South Korea is renouncing such climate targets. As you said, it's one of the world's most fossil fuel reliant economies, and we have coal making up over 41% of the country's electricity mix, and also the renewable power is just over 6%. So we have a very low share of renewables at the moment. So demonstrating these kind of targets actually is a proof of national willingness, and we have a lot to do because we have to first transition each carbon intensive industrial sectors, and in order to meet these targets, we have to cut emissions from electricity generation and heating. So ultimately, the country reduces its reliance on the coal-fired plants and expand the renewable energy sources. I think that's essentially the practical steps that the Korean government needs to take. And at the moment, I'm also kind of reflecting upon how other countries around the world have pledged to transform into carbon neutrality. For instance, where I'm based in right now in Europe, the European Green Deal really highlights the net zero emissions by 2050, and they proposed adopt a set of proposals to transform the EU economy and society. And also within our Northeast Asian regional prospects, we see a lot of potential here as well, because there was a paper indicating how there's at least 6 gigatons of carbon emission mitigation potential within Korea, Japan, and China. And Japan also proposed to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. China has noted their carbon neutrality by 2060, and we know that they're a huge emitter, but they also have a huge potential for renewables because they're the largest producer of solar power. And I think putting this all together, like integrating this, we as a region really have a strong drive to move towards renewable energy deployment, and also driving the cost down for affordable green technologies. And I think this ultimately delivers the message that all countries really need to curtail their fossil fuel consumption and streamline these efforts to meet the timeline for carbon neutrality, because without this, it wouldn't work out.
Thanks, Eunji. So what I'm hearing is it's big, ambitious, but it's possible, and there's a how, there is a way to do it, and you've just outlined that. So I think it's probably time to now think about Australia's action, and I want to bring Kate back on those big statements from major players. Let's talk about Australia. Do you think Australia's global reputation as a laggard on climate policy is affecting or will affect our pursuit of key foreign policy objectives in the region? Big question. We did just get a commitment to 2050, not 2030 though. So yeah, would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that, Kate.
Yeah, so I think Australia kind of has two main policy goals, and that's its relationship with its Pacific and the relationship with the great powers more broadly. So I think when we look at the announcement from yesterday, it was a bit of more declaratory policy as opposed to operational policy. We didn't see much in terms of a policy shift, but it was this big statement. We had like a waving of a pamphlet. Whether or not there was anything in that pamphlet, we're not too sure. But when we look at the individual states in Australia, things are being done, commitments are being made. So I think that's a point for hope and perhaps more stability. There's generally more stability in state politics than there are federal politics. So perhaps it's a better option that our climate policy is in the hands of the state governments as opposed to the federal government. So I think more broadly, Australia's always been bad at climate policy. There was a kind of a blip with Kevin Rudd, as he discussed, But since the 90s, we've never been good at it. So it's kind of, can we be a laggard if we've never really been good, if we were only good for, say, 3 or so years? And I think looking at the Pacific, and Mia, you'll know more about this as well, so feel free to jump in. It's deeply affecting our relations in the Pacific. You know, we have the Bowie Declaration that says climate change is the #1 security threat to Australia, to the Pacific, sorry. As I said earlier, Australia does not think that. You know, geopolitics, China, economics, there are security threats. So by having these kind of two conflicting concepts of security, that's going to affect how these states relate to each other, because they have a fundamental difference of what's important, in whether it's climate or whether it's that. So I think it's going to really affect our relations with our Pacific, going to affect our influence there more broadly. Perhaps they might move to China, Japan, the US, other states in the region. If we take a step back and look at the Indo-Pacific and kind of global powers more broadly, I don't think it's going to affect in any kind of meaningful way. But that doesn't mean we're not going to cooperate. I think there's plenty of room for cooperation. As we've seen Korea and Australia, there's kind of talks about some renewable energy there. Within the Quad framework, there's climate change discussions there as well. But I think it's going to kind of come within these multilateral frameworks. I think one of the things that made me feel the most pessimistic about Australia's climate change reputation was the free trade deal with the UK, where the UK more or less folded to Australia. The UK wanted to have some Paris agreements and climate targets within the framework. And yes, they kind of folded in this post-Brexit economy that they're seeing. But I think if the UK, that's quite symbolic. They're hosting COP. They're this big power. We talk about Australia's relations with the global powers. We have Biden and his kind of renewed efforts on climate change, but yet we also have AUKUS at the same time. So I think in the broader big picture issues, it's not going to affect Australia in any meaningful way, because these traditional concepts of security, this kind of strategic competition that we're seeing, is always going to win out. But I think it's going to deeply affect our people-to-people relations within the region. We're kind of situated between Southeast Asia and the Pacific, which will be some of the most heavily affected, and that's going to affect their perceptions and the kind of future for bilateral cooperation. But I think, again, in the broader, Australia's always been known as this, and it's just something that the bigger states kind of ignore in regards to bigger issues, in quotation marks.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's a lot. That's really big, and I would really encourage a lot of our IR nerds to consider what Kate has said, and whether you agree or not. You know, whether states are going to be acting with us within their own self-interest for things like trade and trade deals, or whether, you know, our climate policy does affect our international relations. So I'd love to keep chatting on that, but we must press forward. Doni, you mentioned before, and I'm going to turn now a little bit to sort of thinking about the future. And I should say, you know, there's been a bit of pessimism up until this point in this chat, because it's such a, you know, dark and gloomy crisis that we're facing. But I was heartened by the most recent IPCC report, which found that although we will continue to face extreme weather events brought about by climate change, it's not too late to avoid total climate catastrophe. So, Doni, I want to bring you in again. You mentioned resilience before. You are a research fellow at the Resilience Institute. So in an era of rapid climate change, what do you mean by resilience, and how can we help rural and small island communities ensure their food and health security?
Wow, that's a $1 million question. But I'm saying $1 million means actually it requires $1 million to actually achieve that. So resilience in different community have different meaning and definition, and also key actions to achieve. And for Indonesia, I'm going to talk about Indonesia because that's my main study and concern forte. It's kind of like the ability that we develop within ourselves to be able to bounce back from the impact of climate change. Although the main challenge of climate change impact, it's always uncertain, it's always changing and rapidly evolving into something bigger than we anticipated earlier on. Although this year at COP26, Indonesia really kind of like highlighting technology investment and how we can kind of like amplify the use of technology and Western science in kind of like preparing ourselves with climate change impact. Not really kind of like a lot of conversation about how to protect our existing green area and the importance of mangroves forests and also traditional owners of the lands itself. So I did a bit of research. I did my big research is actually mainly on how indigenous knowledge and traditional owners take action towards climate change adaptations using their existing knowledge, because the issues that we have with Indonesian climate change adaptation actions, mainly it's kind of like there's a gap in terms of like, what is the word for like misinterpretation and also loss in translation in terms of when we want to talk about climate change. Rural areas, small islanders, and indigenous community have no idea and concepts. This is kind of like a big claim, but this is something that everyone talk about. It's kind of like climate change is kind of like an important term for them, although they already experience changing climates forever throughout their culture, their heritage, their understanding towards the nature, their main observation. And that's their big superpower is actually to observe the nature. They have the entire kind of like culture written, sing, dance, and religion about nature, about how to react and about how to kind of like provide